The conference room on the fourth floor of the Dalton County Courthouse smelled like recycled air and old carpet. My father was looking down at a document when I walked in. He looked up. For a moment, nothing on his face moved at all. He was looking at something that did not make sense to him yet. That would change. But to understand what happened in that room, you need to know where this story actually starts. My name is Rachel Norris. I am 39 years old. I am a licensed nurse practitioner and the founder of Norris Family Health, a primary care clinic on the east side of Dalton, Ohio, which is also the town where I was born, and the town I left at 19 years old, with a duffel bag and $43. I have a daughter named Avery. She is 20 years old and studying environmental science at Ohio State University in Columbus. She is, by any reasonable measure, the reason I'm still standing. I will tell you what happened. But first, I need to tell you what I did between leaving at 19 and opening the door of my clinic at 32, because without that, the rest of this story does not hold its shape. I became an emergency medical technician at 20 years old. I had a 7-month-old daughter and a couch I was borrowing from a coworker. I took the certification course on nights and weekends. I passed on my first attempt. For my first 3 years on an ambulance, I kept a laminated card in my jacket pocket, listing every drug interaction I needed to know, in handwriting small enough that I needed my flashlight to read it in low light. Nobody made that card for me. Nobody was going to catch my errors but me. I had already learned that lesson. I worked emergency services for 4 years. Then I went back to school for my nursing degree on a federal grant, still working full-time. Then I went back again for my nurse practitioner license. It took 11 years from the night I left my father's house to the day I signed my clinic's lease. 11 years of showing up to the next thing, and the thing after that. The clinic smelled like antiseptic, and the cedar of the floor cleaner my office manager used every Tuesday morning. I had never minded that smell. I associated it with the emergency bay at Dalton County General, which was the place I had been most certain of myself for a long time. It still meant the same thing to me. Most mornings, I didn't even notice it anymore. I had no reason to think anything was wrong. That was the problem. My father's name is Gerald Pruitt. He is 68 years old. He is a deacon at First Baptist Church of Dalton, and the retired owner of a plumbing supply company he ran for 30 years out of a warehouse on the south end of town. He is not a villain in the way that word usually gets used. He is something harder to name than that. A man who organized his life around a specific set of rules, and who believed, genuinely believed, that following those rules constituted goodness. I knew that when I was a child, What I did not understand yet was what happened when something fell outside the rules. When I was growing up, he was consistent. The bills were paid, the heat was on. He coached my brother Kyle's baseball team for 6 years. The summer I turned 15, he taught me to drive in the community college parking lot on a Saturday morning, patient in a way I had not expected. I kept rolling the front left tire over the painted curb stop, and he kept saying, quote, 0 without a trace of irritation. Just that flat certainty that I would. I did. I thought about that morning many times after I left. The man who said, quote, 1, and the man who would say what he said later are the same man. I have spent a long time learning to hold both things. My mother was Diane Pruitt. She kept African violets on the kitchen windowsill and made coffee every morning in a red percolator she had owned since before I was born. The kitchen always smelled like that coffee and dish soap and the dried lavender she kept in a ceramic dish by the sink. I did not know the word lavender until I was grown. I just knew the smell meant she was nearby. She moved quietly through a space in a way that made the space calmer. I held on to that. I held on to a lot of things longer than I should have. My brother Kyle is 2 years older than me. He had a good job and a steady girlfriend and had never, not once, given my father a meaningful reason for concern. I am not faulting him for that. I am noting it because it matters. I was 19. Second semester at Dalton Community College. Working the diner on Route 9. Dating a boy named Danny who was honest when honesty was hard, who told me directly when I showed him the test that he was not ready to be anyone's father. I respected that. He told me the truth. That was more than some people in this story did. I went home to my parents because that was what you did. You went home. My father did not raise his voice the night I told him. He set the remote control on the side table slowly, the way he did when he was managing something. He got quiet. He said I had put the family in a position he was not willing to accept. He said choices had consequences. He said he would not have this in his house. My mother said his name once. He said no. He stood up, turned the television off, and went to bed. My mother sat at the kitchen table for a while without looking at me. The percolator was still cycling, that soft, bubbling sound it made when it was done, and nobody had turned it off. Eventually, she got up and turned it off, and rinsed her cup and went to bed. My brother stood in the hallway doorway, looked at me, looked at the floor, and went back to his room. I packed a duffel bag and a backpack at 2 in the morning. I took my winter coat, my documents, the money in my wallet, and a framed photo of my mother I took off my dresser. I stood in the dark kitchen for a moment. I do not know why. Then I left. 7 days later, I called from a payphone at a gas station off the interstate, where I was staying on the couch of a girl from the diner who had not asked any questions. My mother answered. I said, "Mom, it's me." There was a pause. Then she said, "Rachel, I can't right now. You need to respect your father's decision." She said she hoped I was safe, then she hung up. I stood at that payphone for a while after the line went dead. Something cold settled in my chest, right below the sternum, and it had nothing to do with the November air. A semi pulled into the lot, and its headlights swept across the pavement. I put the receiver back on the hook, and I walked to the borrowed car and sat in it in the dark. That was the last time I spoke to my mother for 19 years. I built a life. I came back to Dalton at 32 because the east side of town needed a primary care provider, and I was one. I bought a small house on Clement Street. A year after we moved back, I drove Avery to Columbus and helped her carry boxes up 4 flights of stairs to her dorm room, and I drove home alone and cried for about 40 minutes, and then made dinner. I would find out later that my mother had been diagnosed with cancer 18 months before she died, and that she had never told me. The Tuesday morning in April started the same as any other. 4 scheduled appointments, an open walk-in slot mid-morning. At 9:40, my receptionist Mara knocked on my office door between patients. "Walk in," she said. "Older gentleman. Wanted to establish care. Just moved back from Chillicothe." I said fine, get his intake paperwork started, and I finished my notes from the previous patient. I have a habit from my ambulance days. Before I enter a room to see a patient, I stop in the hall and look through the narrow window in the door. It only takes a second. It is not a clinical protocol. It is the kind of thing you start doing after you have walked into enough uncertain rooms. I stopped at the waiting room door. I looked through the window. He was heavier than I remembered. His hair was almost entirely white. He was wearing a flannel shirt I didn't recognize, squinting at his phone with the slight frown of a person who needs reading glasses and hasn't admitted it yet. But the shape of his face, the set of his jaw, the way he sat in the chair with one arm across the armrest, slightly reclined, as if he had every right to be wherever he happened to be. I had known that posture my entire life. My hand was on the door handle. I stood there for about 15 seconds. Then I went back to my office and picked up his intake form. Gerald H. Pruitt. Date of birth, July 9th, 1956. Address, 4418, Meridian Road, Dalton, Ohio. The house I grew up in. I picked up my pen. I walked in. He looked up when I entered. I watched his eyes do the brief work of deciding whether to recognize a face. It passed. His expression settled into the polite neutrality of a man at a medical appointment. Dr. Norris, he said, reading my badge. Nurse practitioner Norris, I said. I shook his hand. I sat across from him. I asked about his blood pressure history, his current medications, the chest tightness he had noted on his intake form. I listened to his heart. I listened to his lungs. I asked the questions I would ask any patient, and I wrote down every answer. He mentioned he had moved back after time in Chillicothe, caring for an elderly relative. He mentioned First Baptist. He mentioned his son, briefly, the way people do when they are establishing that they have someone in the world, that someone knows their name. He did not mention a daughter. I noted that with the same part of my mind that notes everything. I wrote the orders. I gave him a cardiac referral. I told him to follow up in 6 weeks. He thanked me, shook my hand again with the same neutral courtesy, and walked out. I went to the single-stall bathroom at the back of the clinic and ran cold water over my wrists for 30 seconds. I learned that technique on the ambulance when I needed my system to cooperate and I did not have time to wait for it. It works. Then I went back to work. 2 weeks later, a certified letter arrived at the clinic addressed to Rachel Norris. The return address said Weatherby Estate Law, Dalton, Ohio. I opened it at my desk at 6 in the evening after Mara had gone home. The letter told me that my mother, Diane Louise Pruitt, had passed away on March 3rd, 6 weeks earlier. It expressed condolences. It told me that in the final months of her life, she had executed a revised will and that the contents directly concerned me. My brother had my cell number. Avery had given it to him 2 years before, trying to build a bridge I had not asked her to build. He had my number. My mother had been dead for 6 weeks and nobody had called her. I set the letter down on my desk and looked at it for a moment. The clinic was quiet. Outside, through the window, the parking lot was empty in the flat gray light of an Ohio evening in April. Something shifted in my chest. Not the cold from 20 years ago. Something older than that and more specific. I called my brother that night. Kyle picked up on the second ring. His voice was careful when he heard mine. Not surprised. Careful. He said he had been meaning to call. He said things had been complicated. I asked about the will. There was a pause. Then he said, Rachel, I think you need to understand that Mom wasn't always in the clearest state of mind in those last months. I think you also need to understand that we can't just open things up to someone who hasn't been part of this family for 20 years. Dad made certain decisions. I supported those decisions. We all have to live with the consequences of choices we made. We all have to live with the consequences of choices we made. He said that to me. About our mother's death. After we hung up, I opened my laptop. I pulled up the Dalton County Recorder's website and typed in the address on Meridian Road. The deed to my childhood home had been transferred to Kyle Allen Pruitt 4 days after my mother died. Filed on March 7th. Her body had not been in the ground a week. I sat at my desk for a long time. I thought about the African violets. I thought about the red percolator. I thought about the dried lavender in the ceramic dish, and how she had kept it there for every single year of my childhood without ever explaining it, just kept it there, and I had grown up breathing that smell and never knowing its name. I closed the laptop. They had no idea what they had just done, and I was going to let them keep not knowing, for a while. Now, I want to be clear about where I was at that moment. I did not have a plan. I had a certified letter, a dead mother, and a property record that raised more questions than it answered. What I did have was the habit of mind that had carried me from a payphone at a gas station to a clinic with my name on the door, which is the habit of moving precisely when you are most tempted to move fast. I had been in enough high-stakes situations to know that urgency is just pressure, and that pressure belongs to whoever can stay calmer under it longest. What I was about to find out next would change everything I thought I knew about how long this had actually been going on. The first person I called was not an attorney. It was Donna Hatch. Donna had been a supervising EMT at Dalton County EMS when I was 20 years old and newly certified and terrified of doing something wrong on a call. She was 53 at the time, with 30 years on the ambulance and the kind of economy of movement that comes from spending decades being the calmest person in a very bad room. She taught me to read a scene before I entered it. She taught me that the question you ask in the first 60 seconds determines what information you get. She retired to a house on Lake Erie near Sandusky, and I had called her maybe 4 times in 20 years. Each time when something was happening that I did not have a clear framework for, I told her the short version. She was quiet the whole time. When I finished, she said, "Property transfer 4 days after death. That's not grief, that's preparation." She told me to write down 2 names. One was Marcus Webb, an estate and probate attorney in Columbus who had been, in Donna's words, quote, 8, quote, the other was the phrase, quote, 9, quote, which she said I needed to understand before I walked into any attorney's office. She said it slowly, as if she was dictating it. I wrote it down. She said, "Rachel, you went to school twice while working full-time with a baby. You do not need me to tell you what to do next." Then she said goodbye and hung up. That was the entirety of the pep talk. It was exactly enough. I called Marcus Webb the following Monday morning. His office was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Columbus, and he met me in a conference room with a yellow legal pad and a cup of coffee he did not touch. He was 61 years old, with a deliberate way of speaking that made every sentence feel like it had been considered before it left his mouth. He had been handling estate litigation for 27 years. His assistant had told me over the phone that he had a particular interest in cases involving undue influence over elderly or ill testators, which was the word for the person who makes a will. I laid out what I had, the certified letter from Weatherby Estate Law. The county recorder's deed transfer dated March 7th. My mother's diagnosis, which I had obtained by calling the oncology department at Dalton County General, where I had worked and still had professional relationships, and requesting the records to which I was entitled as next of kin under the terms of the estate notification. My mother had been diagnosed with stage 3 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in September, 18 months before she died. She had undergone 2 rounds of chemotherapy. The second round had been discontinued 4 months before her death. Marcus looked at the dates on the deed transfer. He looked at the oncology intake forms. He looked at his legal pad. He said, quote, 11, I told him I would find out. He said, quote, 12. I drove back to Dalton that evening and went directly to the county probate court the next morning. The clerk confirmed that the estate of Diane Louise Pruitt had entered probate 12 days earlier. The will was a matter of public record. I sat at a table in the clerk's office and read the revised will. It had been executed on January 14th, 6 weeks before my mother died. It named Kyle Allen Pruitt as sole heir to the estate. The house, the remaining contents, and the entirety of my mother's savings account, which held approximately $42,000, had been left to my brother. My name appeared once in a clause that read, quote, 13. I read that sentence twice. I thought about the specific effort it must have taken to put those words there. The specific choice to make sure I knew I had been considered. I wrote down the name of the attorney whose signature appeared on the revised will. It was not from Weatherby Estate Law. It was a notary and document preparation service on Route 9, near the diner where I had worked at 19. The kind of office that handles simple wills for a flat fee. The kind without extensive review of testamentary capacity. The original will was filed behind the revised one in the probate record. I asked for a copy of that too. I sat back down at the table and read it. The original will had been executed in 2011. It named both Kyle and me as equal heirs. It had been prepared by a proper estate attorney, a firm in Columbus that I had never heard of, but that Marcus would recognize immediately. It was notarized and witnessed by 2 people whose names I did not know. And then I pulled the county records for the savings account transfers, which Donna had told me were sometimes filed in conjunction with probate, and I saw the date. and I had to sit down. $42,000 had been moved from my mother's personal savings account to a joint account held by my mother and my brother on October 9th, 2 years before she died. Before her diagnosis, before the revised will, before any of it. My mother had not been dying yet when that transfer happened. She had been exactly herself. Whatever my brother had said to her, whatever he had done or suggested or implied, to move that money before she was sick, before she could be argued to have been impaired, that was not opportunism after a death. That was planning before one. I drove to the clinic. I sat in my car in the parking lot and I looked at the copies in my hands. The original will, the revision, the transfer date. I thought about the certified letter, the one that told me my mother had died and that her wishes concerned me. The letter had come from Weatherby Estate Law, not from the document preparation office on Route 9. Someone at Weatherby had sent me that letter. My mother had used Weatherby for the original will in 2011. She had gone back to them in her final months, and they had followed her instructions to contact me. She had known what was happening. She had known what my brother and father were doing, and she had not been able to stop it. But she had made sure I found out. I went inside and saw my patients. 4 appointments, 2 walk-ins. I did not tell a single person what I was holding. I had everything I needed. But I hadn't told them that yet. I want to pause here for a moment, because I think it is important to be honest about what I was feeling during those 2 weeks. Which was not righteous or strategic or any of the words that might make this sound cleaner than it was. I was sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night. I was eating at my desk. Avery called me twice, and I kept the conversations short because I could not hold 2 things at once, and the thing I was holding was very heavy. What I was about to find, through a person I had not thought about in 20 years, was going to rewrite everything I believed I understood about the original betrayal. Everything. And I mean that exactly. The call came from a woman named Patricia Soule. She had been my mother's neighbor on Meridian Road for 31 years, since before I was born. I had grown up across the street from her. She had gotten my clinic number from the county phone directory and called at 8 in the morning on a Wednesday. And when Mara told me who was on the line, I had to stand still for a moment before I picked up. Patricia spoke in the careful way of someone who has been deciding for a long time whether to say something. She said she had been my mother's closest friend. She said my mother had talked about me often for 20 years. She said she was sorry she had not called sooner and that she was calling now because she felt it was the right thing to do, and also because she had known for some time that what was happening in that house was not right. And she did not want to be a person who stayed quiet about it. I asked her to come to the clinic. She drove herself and sat across from me in my office and set a manila envelope on the desk between us. She had found the envelope in her own mailbox 6 months earlier, before my mother died, labeled with her name and the words ___, quote _1, 4 ___. Inside was a handwritten letter from my mother, 4 pages. On the same pale green notepad paper she had kept in the kitchen drawer my entire childhood. I knew the paper immediately when I saw it. Something happened in my throat. The letter described what had happened in the house during my mother's illness. My father had managed her medical appointments. My brother had handled her paper. She had asked to call me and had been told by both of them that I had been notified and had declined to come. She had believed this in 5 months. She had spent 5 months believing I knew she was dying and had chosen not to come home. I did not know my mother was sick. Nobody had called me. Nobody had sent a letter. Nobody had told me anything. My mother had died believing I did not want to be there. I read that sentence in her handwriting, and then I set the letter down and looked at the window and did not say anything for a while. Patricia reached across the desk and put her hand on mine briefly and then took it back. She did not say anything either. She was the right kind of person for that moment. The letter also described the visit from the attorney at the document preparation office on Route 9. My brother had arranged the appointment. My father had been present. She had signed the revised will in her bedroom because she could not easily get to a car at that point. The letter said, and I am paraphrasing because the phrasing was my mother's and I am keeping it, that she had not felt free to refuse, that she had signed because it was easier than the other option, which was to fight two people she lived with while she was dying. She had used Weatherby for the original will because they were thorough, she wrote. She had called them from Patricia's house, on a day when Kyle was at work and my father was at a church meeting, to tell them what had happened and to instruct them to contact me after her death. She had been asking Weatherby to find me for months. They had found the clinic. They had sent the letter. My mother's last act, as a person who had spent 20 years managing a household whose rules she had not made, was to leave a thread she knew I would follow. Marcus Webb read the letter and the account transfer documents and the two wills and did not speak for 4 minutes. I watched him read everything twice. When he looked up, he said, quote, 15. He said, quote, 16. He paused and then said, quote, 17. He looked at me for a moment. Quote, 18. Their attorney called 3 weeks later with a settlement offer. $22,000 and a release of all claims. I asked Marcus to decline it. He asked me if I was certain. I said I was. I had one meeting left. And I had been waiting for it for 20 years. Everything I had done for the past 3 months had been preparation for one room, one table, one morning. Marcus had told me to let him lead and I told him I understood. Which I did. I also knew there was one moment, one specific moment in that room, when I was going to say something. One sentence. I had been thinking about it for 11 weeks. I knew exactly when to say it. I knew exactly what would happen after. We pulled into the parking garage at the Dalton County Courthouse at 8:47 in the morning. I remember checking the time. I remember the sound of the engine going quiet, and then just the sound of the garage, that concrete silence, before we got out of the car. The conference room on the 4th floor of the Dalton County Courthouse had 4 windows that faced the parking structure and let in a flat gray light that made everything look slightly overexposed. There was a long rectangular table, 8 chairs. A water pitcher nobody touched. It smelled like the carpet cleaner they used in public buildings, and something faintly metallic that I associated with forced air heating. I had been in rooms like this before, not this specific room, but this category of room. Rooms where the outcome was already determined by what you brought through the door. I wore my navy clinic blazer and the gray slacks I wore for hospital consultations. I had thought about this choice deliberately the night before. Not armor, not performance, just the clothes of a person who belonged in professional spaces, who had always belonged in them. Who had spent 20 years earning the right to walk into any room in this county and be taken seriously. Marcus entered first. I came in behind him. My father was already seated on the far side of the table. My brother Kyle was next to him. Their attorney, a man named Fitch I had not previously met, was at the head of their side, arranging papers with the practiced efficiency of someone who considered this meeting a formality. My father looked up when the door opened. His eyes moved to Marcus. Then they moved to me. I watched his face do the work of placing me. It took 4 seconds. I counted. His expression did not change the way people describe expressions changing in stories. No color draining. No visible shock. It was more precise than that. It was the expression of a man whose entire organizational framework for a situation had just been removed from beneath him, who was now doing rapid silent reconstruction, and who did not yet know how to arrange his face while that was happening. Kyle looked at the table. Fitch said good morning and introduced himself and suggested we get started. His tone was the practiced warmth of a man who believed he already knew how the next 2 hours would go. He had a leather portfolio open in front of him. He explained the terms of the estate as filed. He cited the revised will. He cited the deed transfer. He laid out the legal position with the confidence of someone who had reviewed this case and found it clean. I sat with my hands folded on the table and I listened to all of it. Marcus made procedural notes. He asked 2 clarifying questions about filing dates. Fitch answered them easily, still warm, still confident. At one point, my brother leaned over and said something quietly to my father, and my father gave a small nod, and there was something in that small nod, that private confirmation between them, that I registered and set aside. Marcus opened his briefcase. He removed a folder and set it on the table and pushed it toward the center without saying anything. Inside was a tabbed set of documents. The original will from 2011, the revised will with the Document Preparation Office letterhead, the savings account transfer dated October 9th, the oncology records with their timeline, Patricia Soul's signed and notarized statement, and my mother's 4-page handwritten letter on pale green notepad paper, photocopied and certified. I did not say anything. I watched. Fitch looked at the folder. He reached out and opened it to the first tab. He read for a moment. He turned to the second tab. His hand moved more slowly when he turned to the third. He read the transfer date. He set the folder down and looked at it for a moment without turning to the fourth tab. Then he turned to the fourth tab. He read Patricia Soul's statement. He turned to the fifth tab. Nobody in the room spoke. My father was looking at the photocopied letter. I watched him look at the handwriting. I watched the moment he recognized it. His jaw tightened once, a small involuntary movement, and then he was very still. Kyle was looking at his hands. The probate magistrate, a woman named Judge Carla Weston, who had been brought in to oversee the proceeding, had been reading her own copy of the documents that Marcus had submitted to the court 3 days earlier. She had been quiet since we sat down. She looked up from her copy now and addressed Fitch directly. She said, "Counselor, I want to direct your attention to the execution circumstances of the revised instrument. A will signed in the testator's bedroom 6 weeks prior to death, in the presence of the sole beneficiary, prepared by a document service rather than a licensed estate attorney, with no independent witness present and no capacity evaluation documented." She paused. "I also want to direct your attention to the account transfer dated 25 months prior to death, before any diagnosis, which this court finds notable." She set her copy of the documents down. "Do you wish to take a recess to consult with your clients?" Fitch said he would appreciate that. The room paused. Nobody had moved yet toward standing. My father was still looking at the photocopied letter. He looked up from it and looked at me. Not through me, not past me, at me. I met his eyes and held them. I said, "She never stopped knowing where I was." I said it quietly. One sentence. Then I looked back at Judge Weston and waited for the recess. The room was very quiet. Judge Weston noted for the record that the revised will presented significant challenges to validation under Ohio probate statute, and that absent compelling contrary evidence, the court was inclined to reinstate the original instrument pending full review. She noted the account transfer as a matter requiring separate examination. Then she called the recess. In the hallway outside the conference room, Marcus stood next to me near the window at the end of the corridor. He looked at the parking structure and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "They'll concede on the will. The account transfer is a separate matter and will take longer, but they know what they're holding." He said it flatly, the way Donna would have said it. Then he looked at me and said, "You built that case correctly." That was all. It was exactly the right amount. I went to the single-stall restroom at the end of the hall and ran cold water over my wrists for 30 seconds. I looked at myself in the mirror. I did not look different. I thought I might look different. I did not. My brother found me in the corridor 20 minutes later, while Fitch was still in conference with my father. Kyle looked the way he had looked in the hallway of our parents' house when I was 19. That same posture of a man who is standing in a place he chose, but is no longer comfortable in. He said he had not known about the account transfer until after it happened. myself the revised will was what Mom wanted. He said he thought I should know that he had not known she believed I had refused to come. I listened to all of it. I looked at him while he spoke. When he finished, I said, quote, 25. He nodded. He looked at the floor. We stood there for a moment without anything left to say, and then I walked back to the conference room. Fitch formally withdrew the revised will the following week. The original will was reinstated. The house was transferred into the estate to be sold and divided equally as the original instrument directed. The account transfer is still in litigation. 2 weeks after the trial, I drove to Meridian Road. I did not go to the door. I parked in front of the house and sat in the car for a while and looked at the kitchen window where my mother had kept her African violets. The violets were gone. The window was just a window. I sat there long enough to feel whatever I needed to feel, which took about 12 minutes, and then I drove home. There is one more thing I haven't told you yet. In my office, on the credenza behind my desk, I keep a ceramic dish with dried lavender in it. I bought it at a market in Columbus the spring after Avery started college. I did not plan to buy it. I walked past a booth and the smell stopped me completely. I stood in the middle of the market aisle for a moment like a person who had heard their name called from a very long distance. Then I bought the dish and took it home. It is on the credenza right now. I can smell it from where I sit most mornings when I'm writing notes on the day's patients. My father still comes to the clinic. He has not transferred his care. I do not know what that means to him. I have not asked. I take his blood pressure, update his medications, answer his questions, and tell him to follow up in 6 weeks. That is all that passes between us, and it is more than I expected to ever have. Kyle and I have not spoken since the courthouse hallway. Avery graduated last spring with honors. She is doing fieldwork in wetland conservation near Sandusky for a year before deciding on graduate school. She does not know most of this story. I will tell her some of it when she is ready to hear it, and I will know when that is. My mother is buried at Riverside Cemetery on the east side of Dalton, 7 minutes from the clinic. I have been there twice. The second time I brought lavender from the garden, I started in my backyard this past June, the first garden I have ever attempted in my life. I set the stems on the stone and stood there for a while in the early morning with the sprinklers from the adjacent section running quietly in the background. I did not say anything out loud. I did not need to. She already knew what I had come to say. If you have been through something like this, I would want to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want to know what happened with the account transfer litigation, that story is not finished yet.